Good morning, everyone. Morning. All right. I don't usually get the call and response, but that's cool. Good morning, everyone. All right, great. Okay, exactly. Thanks. You even know my name. That's really great. Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to, at this point, we're probably talking about the fourth talk in the 12th Annual Life Sciences and Society Program Symposium. I know many of you are here. I haven't seen you before. You may be new. I know you were forced to drink your coffee quickly and shove in whatever snacks you could. There will be more food after this talk before the next talk, so if you need more coffee, you'll have a chance to get some then. Before I get started, I wanted to tell everyone that we are, there is a social media presence for the symposium. So if you're interested in looking on Twitter, the hashtag is LSSP 2016. And you should be able to find, we have some of the speakers have been tweeting, we have some of the staff has been tweeting, so you'll be able to get some interesting commentary there. So as you all know, this year's symposium focuses on climate change. We decided to do this topic about April last year. We put together a committee and we started working on who we're going to invite and what the focus was going to be. One thing I got over and over as I talked to people on campus and in Columbia this last year about climate change was that many people felt like, we know the science is out there, we know there's a debate out there, but people talk about that so much that sometimes we don't hear about the implications of climate change, and we don't hear as much about what we can or should do about it. So we decided with this symposium to focus especially on those kinds of things. This morning's talk is a good example of that. An implication of climate change has lots of implications for agriculture, for health, for other things. And so today we're going to hear a lot about those kinds of consequences. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Mary Hendrickson, who's going to introduce today's speaker.
Good morning, everyone. It's really my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. As you can see from the program, you know he's a towering figure in sustainable agriculture and agriculture in general. I was first introduced to his philosophy when I read his book, New Roots in Sustainable Agriculture, which was required reading and continues to be required reading in sustainable agriculture and environmental sciences and other programs. But I think it's when I've heard him speak that his message has really sunk in. Now, he's trained as a geneticist. He's authored several books, but he also founded an institute that has a research institute that is looking at breeding perennial grains for the first time in human history. That's kind of big. And he's also been educating thousands of people on the benefits of perennial polyculture. And he's managed to do all of this in the Midwestern belly of industrialized agriculture, which I think is also pretty big. More important, I think, is his fight to make society understand the importance of agriculture and our current practices of it to our human future. Now, yesterday, he chides those of us who know that farmers markets and CSAs really do make a difference, because he said, we can't condescend to the farmers and rural people who are on the front lines of producing the food that feeds 95% or makes up 95% of our diet. So his life work has really centered on the problem of agriculture, which is pretty interesting because it provides our sustenance, but it was really the first human attempt to exploit stored carbon, right? And in that sense, I think our speaker would call it humanity's original sin. I think I've heard that before. Now, his questions, yesterday we had a chance to meet and talk with him. How do we mimic nature and integrate ourselves within it? That continues to be one of the driving moral and practical questions of our time. Yesterday, in a meeting with students, he quoted Isaiah and Virgil and David Ricardo and a bunch of other people and modern scientists to explain how we have to transcend disciplinary boundaries. Really, we have to transcend our way of knowing if we're going to overcome being captive to a system that will exploit carbon to the end of its death throes. Now, the room yesterday was silent, not from disinterest, but rather in awe of the thinking and doing challenge that was laid out before him. And this was students, and this was senior scientists as well. And we were all like, wow, we have to think. Now, I have no doubt in the next hour that the founder of the Kansas-based Land Institute will chide us and caution us and challenge us. But most of all, he's going to inspire us to take on the challenge of confronting climate change. So let's welcome Wes Jackson.
Do it? Yep. Well, that's an achievement. Well, Mary, thank you. That was pretty close to the way I wrote it. Well, it's good to be here. I see a lot of familiar faces going way back to some of the early radical days and some 40, 50 years ago now. And it's good to be with old friends. I want to frame this talk by starting with the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. The Declaration of Independence said that we're all created equal. That was a high moral moment in the history of Homo sapiens. The Constitution allowed for legal chattel slavery, and the war came. 750,000, the largest killing in aggregate of all wars in the Western Hemisphere. So there was the high moral, and there's the legal. We still have that problem. We know we need to protect the ecosphere. We know we need to save our soils. We know we need to stop greenhouse gases from accumulating. We know all that. We got that high moral, but it's legal to rip the tops off mountains. It's legal to put chemicals over the agricultural landscape that our tissues have no evolutionary experience with. It's legal to create dead zones in the Gulf. It's legal to drill in the Arctic. It's legal, it's legal, it's legal. And so we're still caught between the high moral and the legal. Now, President Obama, he issued a plan to fight climate change. And here is where the moral necessity confronts the legal activity, which is a derivative. Is this a consistent voice? There's always something wrong with what I'm doing, I can tell you that.
All right, I'm going to retie this.
Yeah.
A little higher. I think that hopefully that
Well, wait till my tongue flies out of my mouth here. Yeah.
Exactly right.
What's that? I just love to be attended.
Okay, speak like that.
Well, okay, how am I doing?
Hold on. Now I'm going to tie it.
Do I get these extra minutes at the end? No coffee or food after the talk?
We have a little time.
All right. All right. So I grew up on a farm in the Kansas River Valley, and my passion is agriculture. And what I have noticed in my some 80 years is that the demise of the small towns and the rural communities is the consequence of what I'll call the industrial mind. And the industrial mind has associated with it what I'll call technological fundamentalism, which tends to take over where thought leaves off. And here we are. I think that clearly within 200 years, whatever humanity is around will have to have regarded the Industrial Revolution as a bad idea. even all the gains that have come in that period. I'm glad to know that we're products of a dying star. I'm glad to know that the carbon that enters so importantly in our bodies was cooked in the remote past there. And from it, at lower temperatures, came nitrogen and oxygen. These are indispensable elements. Were spewed out into space to mix and form planets and eventually we ourselves. I'm glad to know that we're products of the simian line. I'm glad to know a whole bunch of things in our time. I'm even glad for penicillin, which has probably done more to create a problem in terms of the standing crop of Homo sapiens that cannot regulate. I'm glad to know all of that. But what has that come at a cost? That I think it began 10,000 years ago when we, at the eastern end of the Mediterranean, it's drying out. And there's where the greatest group of revolutionaries to ever live started giving us essentially all of our crops and livestock. And that was the moment. That was the 10 to 12,000 years ago. That was what I think is the biblical fall. And what was the condemnation for that? Thistles and thorns and sweat of the brow. We weren't meant to do that, we creatures of the Upper Paleolithic. If we were meant to be farmers, we'd have had longer arms. That most of humanity's time, if you take the largest slice, make a pie figure, the biggest slice of what humans have done for that 10 to 12,000 year period, and if you're looking for one word that defines Homo sapien, we're weeders. In other words, we disturb the soil. In order for us to eat, nature had to be subdued or ignored. And that dualism has been with us and has informed our philosophies in so many different ways. Whether we're talking about, Aristotle or Plato or Whitehead or whoever, we have that kind of dualism that there is the wild, that is nature, and then there is the domestic, which is what is necessary for us to get our sustenance and health, source of our sustenance and health. So Mary said that, yes, what I've been about since 1977 is to talk about and try to solve the 10,000-year-old problem of agriculture, and as a derivative, be able to solve many other social, political problems at once, because there is this, what I think is a reality. And I got it from my friend Chuck Washburn, I used to teach with at Cal State Sacramento. Chuck once said, if we don't get sustainability in agriculture first, it's not going to happen. Agriculture ultimately has a discipline behind it. It's called ecology and evolutionary biology. And we wouldn't probably have that discipline, well, certainly, if we hadn't had soil carbon, forest carbon, coal. We would not have had Darwin, for instance, without all that, because it comes with the slack that's necessary. So if we have to find our return to something closer to an original relationship with the world as a result of having been this species out of context. And so that's what, back some, in 77, just a little quick history on this. I'd read the General Accounting Office study on how well the money for soil conservation had been spent. And it looked to me like reading that report that soil erosion was as bad in the 70s as when the Soil Conservation Service was formed in the 30s under the energetic and imaginative Hugh Hammond Bennett. It was in the Roosevelt administration. I read somewhere one time, and I've not been able to find it, that 1/7 of the total federal budget was devoted to soil and water conservation. Now, a lot of that was the CCC work that was going on under Roosevelt. But there was a commitment to saving our soils and protecting our watersheds and so on. And here is this study, looks to me like thousands of miles of terraces, grass waterways, all that money, an organization put together with people devoted to the common task, and here this is. Why is it that we're not winning? So I took my students on a field trip to the Kansa Prairie, some 8,000 acres of never plowed tall grass prairie. And while there, old Lloyd Holbert, a good ecologist, gave us a wonderful day. And I went home and I was thinking, here was a system that had no soil erosion beyond natural replacement levels. There are no alien chemicals being introduced, no fossil fuel unless you want to look at the barbed wire that goes around the property, which is the result of the Industrial Revolution. And then here's just down the road our wheat, dependent upon fossil fuels, corn, sunflowers, soybeans, the whole thing is dependent upon the extractive economy, and it's eroding. And so that's what set me off. Why do we not have perennial grains? We have never had perennial grains in this whole period. Some people think we had perennial grains and we did something and made them annuals. That's not true. We've never had perennials. They've all been annuals. And so just to, let's see, there's one of these clickers. You people are so fancy around here. I went home, and on the back of a grocery bag, I drew up a dichotomous key. I'd started out in plant taxonomy, so I know about keys. And so I was thinking about the different relationships that we have on the landscape. We have monocultures and we have polycultures. We have some plants that are woody, some plants that are herbaceous, some plants that are annual, some that are perennial. And if you look at all of those combinations, there are 16 of them. 4 of them are irrational because there's no such thing as a woody annual. So you get rid of those 4. Now you have 12 meaningful combinations and 11 of those combinations have been filled in that humans are using one way or another. But then there was this blank: herbaceous, perennial, seed-producing polycultures. And it just blinked. So that's what set me off to explore the possibility of hybridizing the current crops with their close perennial relatives, or domesticating wild species that are in the grass family, the legume family, and the sunflower family. Humans are primarily grass seed eaters. The number 1 crop of the planet in terms of calories is rice. Number 2 is wheat. Wheat is number 1 in acreage. Number 3 is corn or zea maize. Number 4 is potato. Then you're back into grasses and legumes again. So those are some 70% of our calories, grown on about 70% of our acreage worldwide. So if we're to solve the problem of agriculture, we've got to deal with those grains. And so why not perennial grains? And rather than be in annual monocultures, we're looking at the perennial polyculture. So just as a sort of a reminder, as far as climate change is concerned, and I wasn't thinking about this at the time, but land use is is number 2 as a source of greenhouse gases, behind power plants and head of all transportation. And yet, we don't have the Prius equivalent or the squiggly light bulb equivalent that tends to get the attention. And flyover country is mostly ignored. And when we talk about sustainable agriculture, and I've been to a few conferences on sustainable agriculture, and frequently a slide is shown that will show the array of plants, and even in the New Yorker, there was a slide about Whole Foods, or a picture of Whole Foods, and it showed a picture of all the things that we eat, and not a single grain mentioned. In other words, all of those things that are necessary for health get the attention, but the flyover country where the grains are produced that really feed us are largely ignored. So here's land use. Number 2 is a source of green gases. And so here are some of the assumptions, though, that went into the early thinking. Soil is more important than oil, and as much of a non-renewable resource as oil. Chris Field at Stanford and Carnegie Institute of Washington did a paper in Science in '02 in which he writes the conclusion is due to his global survey. Get this, gang, natural ecosystems generally have greater net primary production than the human managed systems that follow. And essentially all of nature's ecosystems are perennial mixtures. That was nature, and that's what we plowed under in order to get those annual grains. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Report said that agriculture is the greatest threat to wild biodiversity. And so here we are, paying not enough attention to the fact that a major contributor to greenhouse gases, soil is eroding, the stuff we're made of, there's some 20-some, remember in the upper periodic chart in our chemistry classrooms, in the upper left are those 20-some elements that go into life. All of them are land-based except carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. The rest of them are mostly of the earth. So that's the stuff we're made of that we're allowing to go down the streams. So there was a lot of opposition to the idea that perennialism and high seed yield could go together. And sometime, if I ever get the time, this is a kind of a history of science sort of consideration. There's an idea that started with clutch size in birds. Birds that had few eggs took really good care of their young. Birds that had a lot of eggs, they weren't very good parents. So animals are either R-selected, which is allocating toward reproduction, or they're K-selected to hanging in there. Mice are R-selected, elephants K-selected. So there was this idea. Well, plant people, you know, monkey see, monkey do, wonder if that also applies to plants. Well, they went to work on it, and be careful what you seek, for you will surely find. And sure enough, they found, and I mean from Harvard to Stanford, this was the dogma that perennialism and high seed yield cannot go together, that there is a trade-off. And of course, this fits the capitalist mind very well. you know, the accounting cost benefit and all that stuff. And but the nice thing about science, all you got to do is get your data, publish in your refereed journals. Mostly it's just getting data. And now we know, and I'm going to explain to you, why our ancestors did not develop perennial grains and why we can now. And I'll get to that, but you people, I want you to keep your seats. What kept me going on it, however, is trees are perennials, and they have high yield. They're perennialism and high yield. Where's this trade-off cost? Yeah, well, but they're woody. Now, wait a minute. You're going to exegesis on me now already about the. I mean, let's. So what? Anyway, the trade-off idea is now going away as an absolute. So we started with an inventory stage. Anything that was herbaceous and perennial and winter hardy, we gave it a 5-meter long row. And as we began to develop a staff, as we continued with our car washes and bake sales, we managed to keep the organization going, and now and then getting a grant here and there and so on. Here's David Van Tassel working with developed perennial sunflowers. He and he's done his PhD at Davis, UC Davis in botany. He has also now included another species that I'll mention, talk about later, called Silphium. Stan Cox's sorghum, perennial sorghum, is now growing in Uganda. And we have a postdoc from Uganda working on it. It'll soon spread to 4 other countries in Central Africa. As we all know, most of the farmers of the world are women, and the women in Central Africa, they do not want determinate flowering. They want it to keep on flowering because they want to keep going out and harvesting. And so he has these floppy sorghum populations that no Kansas farmer would be much interested in, but he's also breeding for that as well. Here is Li Han, who started out working on perennial wheat by crossing intermediate wheatgrass with wheat. Intermediate wheatgrass is a perennial. And so Li noticed, as he was also selecting for yield within the intermediate wheatgrass perennial, and noted that the response to selection was so great in terms of increasing seed size, he's about tripled seed size, that he went to work on that totally. We hired Xuan Wang to work on the perennial wheat. And in fact, I'll show you a picture of, I do this everywhere. I'm going to need some help here now. Let's see, maybe I need to turn that. Yeah, let's go this way. We'll flip around here. All right. Now I need somebody in the middle. Here we go. Well, here, you come to the... No, I want you watching. Yeah. Get Mary up here. Come here, Mary. All right. All right. There at the top is the species that started civilization, the wheat plant. And this is the first perennial grain in the history of Homo sapien. This is the intermediate wheatgrass that Li was working on, and that plant now is being grown by farmers in southern Minnesota in an experimental sort of way. The seed is being sold to Patagonia, the company, and in starting in April in Washington, Oregon, California, Utah, Colorado, 650,000 16-ounce cans of beer is available. We're getting to basics now, you know. But this is actual size. These photos are actual size. So look at the roots of the perennial and imagine our prairies when we came across the continent, cutting the forest and plowing the prairies. That shear was cutting it about there. That's carbon. I think climate change began with agriculture and tearing up those first ecosystems. And we can now restore those roots, sequester that carbon, and the second part is be far and not have the greenhouse gases going off in the production as we currently have with this plant here, or the corn plant, or the rice plant, or the soybean plant, or any of those annuals. So I'll leave this, we'll just put it right there. There are always people that want to come up and kiss it at the end of the talk, and so in your own way, I'm assuming. All right, now, so here is, that's Li Dihan, and then Xuan Wang on the perennial wheat, and then Xuan again in the greenhouse, and he's actually just discovered an important gene. I won't get into the details of that. And then we're supporting the perennialization of the upland rice in China, and they are now interested in the perennialization of the paddy rice, and a main reason is that they understand that the empowerment of women has to do with the reduction of dependency on labor and a chance for more education, and this will free them up. And so you have the greatly free them up, by the way. So that's being advanced, and they actually the perennialization of the upland rice is moving quite fast. And then here is Tim Cruz, our director of research and ecologist. Now the thing is to start putting them together, put these species together, because here's what we're after: efficiencies inherent within the natural integrities. Now I'm going to say it again, and I want you to say it after me, and you'll do better on the second time. Efficiencies inherent within the natural integrities. Again, efficiencies inherent within the natural integrities. I accept the nomination, President of the United States. So we're filling the blank. And does this have legs? Well, it's around on all 5 continents now. These are colleagues, and this year we're spending $1 million on graduate students and postdocs around the country that are working on our kind of stuff. And so this is starting right at the bottom, mostly young, well, they're all young people, and we, at the land, we have a postdoc on wheat at K-State, on the Kernza, Oklahoma State wheat, well, you can read, 5 of them up at the University of Minnesota. Then, so get this, and now I got to tell you what I think is one of the, well, I'm going to get ahead of myself, but what I care. 3 of our guys have found out why our ancestors did not develop perennial grains and why we can now. And here's the story. Annuals tend to self, that is, accept their own pollen. That's the tightest form of inbreeding, self times self. Perennials tend to outcross. Now let's imagine we're all of a tribe, and we're at the eastern end of the Mediterranean, and it's 5,000 years ago, it's the Bronze Age, Iron Age, and we're in the front end of the Epic of Gilgamesh, and we see intermediate wheatgrass growing there, and by the way, it does. It's all around the Mediterranean. And we say, boy, that has some potential. So we go out and we pull off some seed, and then we plant it out. Those are all half sieves. We know the mother, but we don't know where the pollen's coming from. Got it? Do you have that? Half sieves. So then we start crossing those half sieves, and we find there are a whole bunch of aborted embryos. And that is on the lethal mutations are now coming in. And then you get the few seeds that do make it, and they're ugly things. That's genetic load, mutational load. And my bet is that every century for 10,000 years, humanity tried that somewhere with every one of the major crops, and they failed. In trees, they too are outcrossers. But how do we get superiority in trees? By pruning off a limb that's a mutation that looks good. But when we try sexual selection with trees, you got the genetic load problem again. Now, as a result of some modern genomics and so on, they're able to overcome some of that. So it wasn't a physiological trade-off problem, due to the R and K selection formula. It was genetic load. So a kind of a Sherlock Holmes approach on the part of 3 of our guys over about a 3-year period came to that conclusion that here was why they didn't do it. So I'm over at Mizzou Botanical Garden and St. Louis University giving some talks, and I'm saying, look, what we need to do is a global inventory. So they said, look, our computers are tied to all the major botanical gardens of the world. They're tied to all the major herbaria. We can do that. So we say, well, how much is that going to take? Over a 3-year period. But to get started, I don't know, $500,000. So we're on it. That's why you see Mizzou Botanical Garden up there, global inventory. Now, imagine, look, the last time we've had a new major crop is 3,500 years ago. I'm imagining several herbaceous, perennial, seed-producing candidates becoming available for a whole bunch of grad students and postdocs in the foreseeable future. So we're not just stuck with our current annual inventory. This material is getting around, and we're looking forward. We're just in the first year of the folks over at Mizzou Botanical Garden doing the inventory. Now, Jefferson said that the greatest service which can be rendered any country is to add a useful plant to its culture. And so now we're able to imagine a great possibility. And here's the way, and I apologize, my friends, for this awful language. But I'm usually not very profane, but I've got to use it now to illustrate. What we're really talking about in discussing the difference between perennial and annual, we're talking about hardware. Here we are using an industrial term for a biological phenomenon. And the annual hardware is limited in its software, and now and then we get a tiny little bit and we call it sustainable agriculture. But essentially, all sustainable agriculture effort that involves grains is stuck with that annual hardware, and what they're calling ecological goes back, a lot of it, to the Greeks and the Romans. but now with new hardware in the form of the Perennial. We open up the potential for different array of software. So where do we get it? Well, for 150 years, on the shelf, ecologists and evolutionary biologists have been pointing out the way ecosystems work. They've done the research. Here is that tremendous body of knowledge out of ecology and evolutionary biology that suddenly becomes available to agriculture as the source for the software. Now, this brings up a very important point. Agriculturists have had the burden to be descriptive. Ecologists and evolutionary biologists have the luxury to be prescriptive. Those are two cultures. One prescribed and the other described. And there's almost this kind of a repulsion, like those little dogs that had magnets on them, you know, that if you probably didn't have toys like that, but that's all we had in Kansas. And there's a kind of a natural repulsion between the ecologists and the agriculturists. I mean, they're trying to overcome it. But the cultural overlay has been heavy. But now that's able to be able to break down. And so that is the big thing. And the next term is the ecological intensification potential. You see, when you have disturbed the soil in order to get that seed of the annual going, you have reduced your diversity even within the soil profile, in which there's a kind of trophic levels within there with the microbes and the invertebrates and so on. So now we have the chance to bring ecology and evolutionary biology to inform a research agenda for agriculture, something that has really been missing. So now we can imagine the end of soil erosion, the end of fossil fuel dependency, greatly reduced use of chemicals, and I can imagine more eyes to acres on the landscape. I imagine that there will be fire and grazing as the primary management tools. At the Land Institute, we have about 160 acres of prairie that I just keep there as the standard. And we have bison on it. There's the standard. So here is nature's wisdom. And then here are our plots, human cleverness. Or, I can't resist this, there's still Methodist in my madness. But Eve in the garden, and Adam shows up. There's a snake involved in this. And they're told to not partake of the fruit of the tree of knowledge. But they partake of the tree of knowledge. And they're driven from the garden. And then the angel with the flaming sword denies access to the tree of life. What we're doing is approaching the angel with the flaming sword and saying, look, we got it straight. Too much water's gone through the turbines to give up on the tree of knowledge. But we got to have access to the tree of life. And the tree of life is the creation as the consequence of the evolution of ecosystems over millions of years. There is the standard. That's the standard. And so we can now imagine that that this, I think, has the potential for us to actually develop an ecological civilization. I think it can help serve as a source of metaphors. Because instead of asking agriculture to fit within an ecological civilization, and actually we start with agriculture as paving the way for basic principles for organizing society in the first place. I'll give you a few examples. What do you find in a natural ecosystem? Tight nutrient cycling. That is, short feedback loops. What does that mean as far as community life is concerned? Short feedback loops. Instead of you widen that loop away from the farm, or you widen that loop away from the community. And when you do that, you pick up so much of the industrial world. We did the 10-year Sunshine Farm study, in which the sunlight that fell on that farm, Marty Bender, who died before it was totally written up, we got a few publications out of it, but the sunlight that fell on that farm had to pay all the bills. And Marty even went back. I mean, we had biodiesel tractor, we grew the soybeans for fuel, we had draft animals, we had cattle, we had 2 5-year rotations, and what we found is that when we widen that loop away from the farm, that's when we begin to pick up the extractive economy. And the most important lesson out of that 10-year study for me has been that you cannot get full cost accounting, because the scaffolding of civilization never gets factored in. Whether it's the board of directors going to a meeting for a company that's manufacturing the tractors, or whether it's the solar collectors, or whether you get the picture. And that's a key idea. The scaffolding of civilization cannot be counted. You may get 1 or 2 or 3 layers, and they call that full cost accounting. But that's the language of the ecologist. So, tight nutrient cycling. And then another thing that can come out of perennial grain polycultures, and in different parts around the globe, and that, to tell you, this is another one of the ideas that gets very little uptake. The internal control of a system is more energy and materials efficient than the external control of a system. I think we've seen that within natural ecosystems. What do I mean? You know about the Rhizobium bacterium that is an anaerobic, but there's an anaerobic bacterium, but you know it's protected by a little shell around it, a spore, and then it attaches to a root of a legume plant. The legume plant grows, the root grows around it, and as it's growing around it, it's eliminating the oxygen, and so at 4/5 of 1 atmosphere, using 21 enzymes at ambient temperatures, atmospheric nitrogen is made available to the plant. What does the most important invention of the 20th century require? The Haber-Bosch process. 1909, 2 Germans learned how to turn atmospheric nitrogen into ammonia. They used natural gas as the feedstock, and not 4/5 of 1 atmosphere, but 350 atmospheres at 400 degrees C. Half the energy cost at the field level is for nitrogen, is for chemical fertilizer. So nature's ecosystem, and that's another efficiency inherent within the natural integrity. And to carry that over as a kind of a general principle for society, as a derivative of our insights, I think is crucial. So what we're talking about is the relationship between information and energy. And I look at it as a kind of a teeter. You got information here, you got energy on one end. You destroy your information in the interest of the elevation of the energy. And so in the great transition in American agriculture, we went from counting on a sufficiency of people and the cultural handing down of information on farming, and high energy destroyed that culture just as it destroys rainforests, which are information intensive systems. You see what I mean? These are the kind of things that we got to be thinking about and that we can learn from. So here's our standard, our prairie, and then here is our agriculture. And we're constantly going to be able to look to what is it that we're doing here that is not what is doing here, what's going on here. There'll be constant compromises, I'm sure. And then Jack Ewell, ecologist friend of mine, University of Florida, working in the tropics, Costa Rica, where they do the slash and burn. He went in there with his colleagues, his students, and they mimicked the surrounding structure that hadn't been destroyed by substituting vine for vine and tree for tree and shrub for shrub. And the rule was they couldn't bring anything they brought in could not have come from that system. And they found out after years of investigation, you mimic the structure, you're granted the function, which includes the tight nutrient cycling and so on. And that's another thing. If we can mimic the structures, we can be granted the function. Well, I'm about to end this sermon. Gary Snyder, my friend, the poet, for his in his book Turtle Island, it's the last poem, and it's called "For the Children." The rising hills, the slopes of statistics lie before us. Got the picture? The slopes of statistics, those rising hills, population, resource depletion, environmental destruction, and so on. The rising hills, the slopes of statistics lie before us. The steep climb of everything going up, up as we all go down. In the next century, or the one beyond that, they say, are valleys, pastures. We can meet there in peace if we make it. To climb these coming crests, one word to you and your children: stay together, learn the flowers, go light. Now, we at the land are contributing to those rising hills with our technology, our lab, our pickup trucks, our tractors, our greenhouse, our computers, the technology which makes all of this work possible to develop perennial grains and run the experiments. Here's the big question. Will all that technology used to bring these new species and varieties into existence be required on the other side? And I say the answer is no. Their creatureliness will make them available even to a Neolithic farmer. So if it all goes down and crashes and we're still around, we can still have our soil and our water, and we'll have arrested the greenhouse gases going up, whatever that is. The creatureliness. The industrial world can't say that. What it takes to bring on the Priuses, and the squiggly bulbs, and the solar collectors is dependent upon that scaffolding of civilization and the extractive economy. So we've answered two of the old religious questions. Where do we come from? We know. We're stardust, products of the thinking of the great liberator, who, by the way, was born on the same day as another liberator. The great liberator, Charles Darwin, and the great liberator, Abraham Lincoln, both the same day. So we know where we came from. We know what kind of a thing we are. We haven't answered the third old religious question, and that is, what is to become of us? So the scriptures say that we've been promised a new heaven and a new earth. Well, the astrophysicists have given us the new heaven. I mean, we no longer have the two-sphere heaven and earth. We don't have that anymore in the old sense. And in that one, you know, angels went back and forth carrying messages. You know, the medieval painters, you know, they turned them into part bird, part mammal, because these wings they had out there. But we don't have that now. And we now have, I think, a better understanding. So, in one sense, though, we're like Dante entering a dark wood. You remember he went into that dark wood, and he tried to go up toward the angelic hierarchies, and he got turned back. And so there he was, stuck in this dark wood. Well, luckily Virgil was around to take him on another tour through hell. And in our time, we're all hoping to avoid several kinds of hell as we make our way through the woods. Or if you prefer, maybe we are entering is more desert-like, but with no Moses or commandments in stone. But in my view, it matters but little that we have neither map nor guide. What we have is something better. We have affection for our ecosphere and the will to negotiate a corrective course. And we have our institutions, our schools, our colleges, and so on. And so, little Gidding, the fourth quartet, I'm sure most of us know it. We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. We have only colonized the earth since we stepped out of Eden. And so we've got the moral high ground, and we have the legal, and we have the ecosphere. The early physicality of the ecosphere gave rise to organisms. And then organisms interacted with that physicality. And that continues to be our creator. That gave rise to us, our creator. And with the atmosphere, our protector. And this isn't too far short from a Methodist hymn. It's not too far short. So, we're not going to destroy the earth. That asteroid that hit 65 million years ago was coming in at 50,000 miles an hour, and it was as tall as Mount Everest at impact. And from the point of view of us in our time, that was a gift from heaven because it allowed the mammals to really take off. And it ended those big, ugly things. I'm in favor of some extinctions, like that one, you know. So we're not going to destroy it, but we may destroy it to the point that it makes it harder for us to live, and it could be less beautiful. So that's my story this morning. And I don't know if we have time for questions or not, but that's up to people that run things around here like Mary. But anyway, thank you for your attention.
I will take 2 questions. David? Yell loud.
The Perennial.
Start over again.
We happen to be in the Monsanto auditorium, and on an unrelated note, has there been any blowback you've had from people whose financial interests are heavily vested in the preservation of annuals?
No. Not from those that count. No. Look, it's partly the wonderful thing about not having been taken seriously all these years is that nobody cares. There's some kind of eccentric bunch of environmentalists that are plant breeders and ecologists and soil scientists out there at the Land Institute. Yeah, well, we know the real story, and they're not hurting much and so on. And, you know, they put on an intellectual hootenanny every September that's kind of nice to go to, and so on. We've just not been taken seriously. Now, we are now being taken seriously enough that in order to keep our germplasm in the public domain, we are exploring spending money on lawyers about the patenting to protect it, which is an odd thing to have to do, but you know, the forces are out there. So, yeah. Now, actually, what I'm getting is a lot of enthusiasm from especially young graduate students. Of course, we're given $1 million this year for that. Oh, by the way, let me see what I have here. Oh, that's just to show you an annual grain field, but this is what you have to do to have it at the bottom. And then these are nature's ecosystems. And then this is all the kind of efficiencies inherent within the natural integrities. And this is one of our fields of Kernza. You know, just keeps coming up. And then we're combining it. And, you know, we're just being real farmers. Well, there's a movie, but I won't show you the movie. Takes too long. Let's have another question.
How long does it take?
2 minutes.
How long does it take to get a perennial plant producing, and how long do they last?
Well, that field you just saw there, that's a 7-year-old field, and you don't get anything to speak of in your first year, but in your second year, yeah, it picks up. Yeah, actually, that root there is less than a year old on that Kernza. No, on that particular photograph, that root is 2 years old because we've got yield in the second year. Now you see the seeds up there. Yes?
Are those fields monoculture that you were?
Actually, they are monoculture, and that's very important because a lot of our minds tend to be so toward monoculture. They're monoculture for us for our research reasons, but Tim Cruz, who's an ecologist, is now putting together bi- and tricultures. And we've actually looked in developing analog systems of how many species it's going to take in order to satisfy whether it's the protection of insects, pathogens, or get the biological nitrogen fixation. And it's not going to take 8, but it'll probably take at least 3 to 5 species in a polyculture, so far as we can tell.
Thank you so much. You can ask us some more questions later.
Yeah.